Okay, so tonight is the last presidential debate, and they changed the rules so they can mute the microphone of the candidate whose turn it isn't, so hopefully it'll be a little bit more civil. If you watch tonight's debate, for most of it, and you write something up and turn it in, you can get extra credit, okay? Hopefully it will be a little bit more civilized compared to the first debate. So today we are going to talk about interest. We're going to talk about the different types, benefits, lobbying, and some of the problems with interest groups that we see today. All right, so why do interest groups exist, right? Why are they considered necessary? The reality is we are a pluralistic society. We want various interests and views to be allowed to influence our government. If we all try to advocate as individuals, we'd never get anywhere. So we have to join groups. We have to work together to advocate for our own particular cause. And sometimes we win, and sometimes we lose, right? Inevitably, we may win on one issue and lose on another. And so groups do have to be willing to compromise. They have to take into accommodation the views of others. If you want environmental regulations, you're going to have to join forces with other groups. You're going to have to come together. The idea is to try to represent the majority of society's views, be able to advocate for a larger group of people rather than as individuals. Now, pluralism, of course, doesn't guarantee political equality. It's a fundamental truth that the more money an interest group has, the better educated its members, the more influential they're going to be. So money does still, unfortunately, equal access sometimes. Sometimes certain groups are going to win more often than not. It's not a level playing field. So what exactly are interest groups? They're basically organizations that exist to influence programs and policy. So it's an organized, focused attempt to try and create policy that will benefit its members. And while there is overlap between interest groups and parties, they do have separate goals. Parties are focused on personnel. They want to decide who's running the government. Interest groups are focused on the policy side, what's actually being decided. So So for parties, elections are fundamentally important. For interest groups, not as much. They may care who wins, but no matter what, they're still going to advocate on behalf of their group, no matter who's in charge. For parties, the focus is personnel. For interest groups, the focus is policy. They'll push for their group regardless of which party's in charge. There's a ton of different interest groups. They include labor unions, colleges, corporations, and so on. There's a ton of different types of interest groups. And at heart, their policy is, if we can't win, then we don't want the loss to be painful. If you can't get what you want, you at least want to make sure that you're not going to lose even more. For example, an oil company may not want a new regulation to be passed, right? The regulation may pass anyway. They want to make sure that if that regulation passes, that it also doesn't include something like a penalty for pollution. So if you can't win, you don't want to get hurt that badly. You want to make sure the loss isn't too hard on your group, because you can't win all of the time. You can try to minimize the loss. And so for that reason, most interest groups do tend to be economic. They do tend to represent businesses, various professions, and so on. Right, so again, the most common type of interest group is an economic or corporate interest group. And they represent about 31% of the lobbyists in Washington, D.C. So they're going to represent farmers through the American Farm Bureau Federation. They're going to represent companies like Microsoft, Exxon, General Motors, Amazon, and so on. Then you have labor unions. Now, they're not as large lobbying presence. They only make up about 2% of lobbying interests in Washington, D.C. And they don't have the same money resources that corporations do. They have this people power. We don't want UPS drivers going on strike 2 weeks before Christmas, right? We don't want chaos in the economy. If the UPS drivers are threatening to go on strike, they can get management to the table and make them compromise, right? Nobody wants a shutdown of airport baggage handlers or UPS drivers or teachers. So their strength is in their ability to force management to come to the table sometimes, to use their power to get what they want. There's also professional groups like the American Medical Association that represents doctors. They make up about 23% of the lobbying interests. So for the American Medical Association, they may lobby for stricter regulations on medical malpractice suits or reforming Medicare. There's also the American Bar Association, which is the lawyers' association. They advocate for people in specific fields, law, medicine, business, and so on. There's also citizens groups like Sierra Club, which is concerned with the environment. They can be more influential on policy if enough of them get together and advocate for their cause. Now, when you're looking at a citizen group, you do have to look at what they're actually advocating for. Sometimes businesses will try to masquerade as a citizen group. There was a group that called itself the Partnership to Protect Consumer Credit. Sounds great. But what they were actually advocating for was to make it harder to go after a credit card for practicing financial abuse. They weren't actually advocating for consumers. You gotta look at what they're actually advocating for and make sure it's actually someone advocating for your best interests. Then, of course, we get ideological groups like the Christian Coalition, the National Right to Life Association, who are focused on a specific issue, sometimes religious, sometimes political. There's also public sector interest groups, the National Governors Association. This is where colleges and universities come into play. Harvard, for example, asking for more money for biomedical research. The Brookings Institute, which does a lot of very important political research, needing more funding. That's the type of thing they ask for, more funding for research, development, and so on. All right, so interest groups are necessary, but that doesn't mean they're not without their problems. The poor and the homeless tend to be very underrepresented. This is especially tricky for the homeless. It's hard to get an accurate number because of the transient nature of homelessness. Also, someone can be homeless and not on the streets, right? They can be crashing on a friend's couch for a while or moving from place to place. They are still homeless. They don't necessarily get a lot of people advocating on their behalf. Unfortunately, sometimes policy gets passed that's actually harmful to the homeless. Like cities putting up spikes so people can't sleep on benches. Or in parts of Florida, making it a crime to feed homeless people. So they don't get as much advocacy and as much support. And it is hard to organize them. We do tend to find statistically that interest groups tend to favor corporate and wealthy interests. And part of that is because corporate and wealthy interest groups are made up of people who are well educated, have disposable income, have the time to join in a cause. So they tend to be better organized, better prepared, and better at advocating for their group. So they're going to be more successful than a group of relatively poor individuals who can't organize as well. So interest groups do tend to favor the middle and upper class citizens. It's just kind of the nature of the beast. We need more mobilization for poor people and non-voters. We need more advocacy for homeless people. Setting up more shelters, for example, rather than punishing people. The problem more often than not with the parties and interest groups is that they do tend to focus on the wants of businesses. For example, right now, Congress has been very quick to bail out the big companies and the airlines because of COVID. But they're stalled on a second round of stimulus checks for the majority of Americans because they can't seem to agree on how much, how often, and so on, right? So our needs end up becoming secondary to the needs of businesses, corporations, and welfare interests. So our parties need to be better at representing multiple groups, and we need more advocacy for the people at the bottom. We need people to really try and represent people who don't have anything. Right? It's a bit absurd that it's a crime in some places to feed the homeless. I mean, they arrested an 80-year-old man in Florida for feeding the homeless. It's a little ridiculous. Also, I'm going to get on my soapbox here for a minute, but it irritates me that the airlines need bailed out again, because we actually bailed them out in the 2008 collapse of the economy. But when they got their money back, they put it back into stocks instead of reinvesting it in the airlines, so we wouldn't have to bail them out again. It's actually their fault that we have to bail them out again, but we're still doing it anyway. Right, so interest groups can organize in a handful of ways. For unions and citizen groups, they tend to be membership associations. The members help organize protests and rallies. They vote on leadership. They speak to the press about their causes. Teachers decide that they're fed up with low pay and overcrowded classrooms, and they'll have to decide as a group if they want to go on strike. They'll have to decide what their demands are going to be. The members have a very substantial role in these types of organizations. For more professional interest groups, corporate groups, and so on, they tend to use a professional staff. They want a polished presentation. They want people to walk into a really well-designed office. They want people to answer phones, talk to the media, respond to emails, and so on. So for these interest groups, the members only make financial contributions. They're not really part of the decision making. Someone higher up the food chain makes decisions instead. There's also, of course, the ability to use online or grassroots organization. Ralph Nader is a famous consumer activism, and he formed a coalition in the 1960s to make cars safer. And it's because of him that seatbelts are standard on all cars. That wasn't the case until the mid-1960s. It's also because of him that cars are required to have safety features like airbags and child locks. It started off as a loose kind of cars aren't very safe coalition, and it's turned into this big consumer protection advocacy. You can have hundreds of local chapters. You can meet up as a group. You can have, not right now obviously, but usually like monthly meetings, things like that. The problem interest groups run into is twofold. There's a problem with what's called collective goods. You cannot deny non-members certain benefits. If you're advocating for clean air and clean water, you can't turn around and say, but everybody has to pay for it. You can't say, okay, we'll provide good law enforcement in this community, but not this one. Right? People have to be given the benefits, even if they're not working for it. So this leads into the other problem of what's called a free rider. Someone who benefits from what the group does without actually doing anything to help. People who have benefited from clean air and clean water without ever actually taking any steps to help out. People who don't recycle still benefit from recycling programs, still benefit from clean air and clean water. To give you guys an example you all can understand, think of a free rider like that person in your group project who doesn't do a damn thing but still gets a good grade at the end of the project because you did all the work, right? I'm sure you've all had that, where they get credit even though they didn't do a damn thing. That's a free rider. The person who's like, sure, I'll do this, and then never shows up to the group meeting. That's why I don't do group projects in classes. But you can understand, right? It's basically like you do all the work and they still benefit from it. There's several different types of benefits that apply with interest groups. It can be something like getting a monthly newsletter, the ability to attend a conference, or get trained in the latest technologies. But interest groups tend to find that material benefits work the best. If you offer discounts on travel, a free gift, or health and retirement insurance, people are more likely to join your cause. If you say donate $5 a month, the ASPCA will send you a free tote bag, people are more likely to join because they get the tangible benefits. They see the results of being a member of this organization. A lot of interest groups will try to use some kind of material benefit. The World Wildlife Fund has been running ads where if you donate money, you get like a free calendar and a free plush toy of a protected animal, right? So you get something tangible, a coffee mug, a t-shirt, something that shows your support. There's also networking opportunities. This is kind of an emotional benefit, knowing there are like-minded people out there, people who want to see more environmental protections or better protections for LGBT members. Just knowing that there's people out there who share your goals, that you're not alone. Right? The It Gets Better movement was partly done with the idea of reaching out to young LGBT people and telling them, you're not alone, right? You're not alone in this fight. You've got someone to help you get through this. It's more of an emotional benefit. And if your group succeeds, you get the satisfaction of knowing you are part of that. We tend to see purposive benefits for businesses. For example, if a business joins a certain trade association, maybe they can get national publicity for their business, or we'll publish you in our newsletter, something like that. Gives them the ability to promote their business, get more economic opportunities. So these groups will emphasize what they've done. This small business in Texas joined our organization, and now they're opening their 14th business, right? Something like that. And now with groups having moved online, it is a lot easier to get involved. It takes like 5 seconds to sign a petition on change.org, right? Or to share something on Facebook or Instagram. It's relatively inexpensive and easier to adapt to changes in politics. If 2 million people sign a petition on change.org, someone's going to pay attention to that. If 2 million people email their representative, there's going to be more attention paid to that cause. And so one of the best interest groups in the United States is the AARP. AARP, basically once you turn 55, you're eligible to join. There's 38 million members and they make about 900 million a year. Part of the reason they're so successful is because of all the benefits they offer their members. Discounts on car rentals, airfare, hotels, providing access to affordable health care, low interest credit cards, auto insurance, pharmacy discounts, very tangible benefits that their members see. They're also strong advocates for Social Security. They make it very clear to politicians, you even think about touching Social Security, we'll vote you out of office. They're very successful in what they do. They're very good at getting politicians to support their cause. A lot of interest groups have modeled themselves after AARP because they are so fundamentally successful. That's why we've heard of it, even though none of us are near the age for being eligible for benefits. We all know who they are, we all know what they do. Okay. And over time, interest groups have grown because, one, the government has grown, and two, government regulations have increased. We put into place things like car safety standards, fuel efficiency, and so on. Interest groups are going to spring up for and against these new regulations. If we tell car manufacturers you have to have a set standard of 35 miles per gallon, there's going to be groups advocating for that and against that. Sometimes interest groups come out of various movements. People who were involved in the civil rights movement joined the NAACP, formed their own local chapters of civil rights organizations. People who were protesting the Vietnam War formed consumer groups, environmental groups like the Sierra Club and others. Sometimes it's people forming a movement that leads to change. We've also seen interest groups, religious interest groups, getting involved because of Supreme Court decisions that banned school prayer in the sense that you can't have a public school prayer. Also, when Roe v. Wade was passed, you had organizations that were for and against legal abortion. And with new technology comes new interests. Self-driving cars, right? There's a lot of interest in what that technology will do. Our increasing consumption of gas and oil, changes to the healthcare market, all led to new interest groups. After the Affordable Care Act was passed, you had some groups against it saying it's socialism, it'll create death panels. Then you had others saying it's going to help people get access to health care. So if the government passes new policies, new groups form in response to that. And it's interesting with self-driving cars because you still need someone behind the wheel of the car, right? It can't respond to everything instantly. And there was a case recently where there was an Uber driver in a self-driving car. She wasn't watching the road, she was looking at something on her phone. And the car didn't stop in time and it hit a pedestrian crossing the street and killed the pedestrian. So obviously, if we're going to have self-driving cars, we need to be able to make sure that can't happen. But also make sure people are aware of the fact that it's not going to be able to stop automatically, right? You're still going to have to do something with the technology. It's not a replacement for keeping your eyes on the road. Okay, so the biggest thing interest groups do is lobby. And lobbying is essentially trying to influence a policymaker by directly appealing to the people in charge. It's coming in and saying, I'm so-and-so and I represent Amazon, and I have 5 minutes of your time. And there are some controls on lobbying. In 1995, Congress passed an act that requires organizations to register with Congress, disclose who they're representing, explain what they're lobbying for, and disclose how much they're paying people to lobby for them. We need to know what businesses are being represented. We need to know that maybe Amazon has 500 lobbyists in Washington, D.C., and they're getting paid $75,000 a year. Right? We need to know that kind of information. We need to know who's talking to our leaders. So there's about 12,000 registered lobbyists. Also, here in Texas, lobbyists are required to register with the state. So if you're ever curious to know who's lobbying at the state level, you can actually look it up. Put in Texas lobbying registry or something, and you can find that information. But there's some transparency in that. And lobbyists will help give information to lawmakers, talk to reporters about pending legislation, pay for ads for and against a candidate, and they can help with fundraising. So lobbyists tend to make themselves indispensable for government officials. The reality is that the more money you provide, the more likely you are to be consulted. If you can give Senator John Cornyn a $40,000 campaign donation, he's more likely to give you access to talk to you, to provide information. There is a bit of a built-in advantage for businesses or corporations who can afford to spend more money. There's also a bit of a revolving door in terms of lobbyists. Interest groups like to hire people who work for the federal government. If a member of Congress retires or loses re-election, they'll have about 10 different interest groups who want them to come work for them, because they still have access to key lawmakers. They still have access to Congress. They can still reach out to their friends and say, hey, can you talk to this person? So we see a lot of former government workers becoming lobbyists and going back and talking to the same people they used to work with, which is both good and bad. So businesses are very aware of the fact that they need lobbyists to help them out. In the early 1990s, Microsoft got into some trouble for violating antitrust laws. Essentially, they were accused of forming a monopoly. The Justice Department was looking into them and could have chosen to break up Microsoft. They hired people to advocate for them in the Justice Department. And eventually, they were able to get Congress enough pressure on the DOJ to settle with them and make them pay a fine. They went from possibly being dissolved to you just have to pay a fine. This is when businesses really started getting involved, really started hiring people to lobby for them, to promote their image with the national government. And we do see advisors to the president coming from the lobbying industry. Part of this is because the president knows that he's going to get a lot of pressure from various interest groups to pass certain policies. So if he hires someone who used to work in the lobbying industry, then they can tell him, here's how this group will advocate, here's what this group will want, here's how to deal with this group. So there's a lot of access and a lot of power for lobbyists in Washington, D.C. And if they're very good at their job, they can make upwards of $1 million a year if they're working for a big company. And part of the reason there's so much lobbying is because of the way government agencies have to interact with others. The Administrative Procedure Act gives interest groups and consumers the ability to have a say in various rules and regulations. It requires agencies to provide notice of hearings and give the public the opportunity to comment on proposed regulations prior to their passage. So interest groups can go to a hearing by the EPA on oil industry regulations and so on. The Negotiated Rulemaking Act actively encourages agencies to have open and direct negotiations, to let lobbyists come in and speak to the policy makers. So what we tend to see happening is what's called an iron triangle relationship. It's this relationship that exists between Congress, the executive branch, and interest groups. For example, let's take education policy. The interest groups would be teachers' unions. The congressional committees would be the ones that deal with education, and the executive agency would be the Department of Education. Let's say the Department of Education wants to mandate new state testing. They're going to have to talk to Congress, and Congress is going to talk to the teachers. And the teachers are going to say, we're for this or we're against this. And then they'll go back and talk to the Education Department, and they'll go back and forth. It's this intertwined cooperative relationship between the three different pieces. There's also the ability for citizens to get involved in an issue network. If there's enough pressure, then citizens can affect change. If you look, for example, at the march on Washington, D.C. by high school students after the shooting at Parkland, there was some discussion about new policies for gun ownership. It didn't get very far, but there was at least some discussion, right? And they were being heard by members of Congress. Black Lives Matter activists getting elected leaders to talk about more police bias training or the use of body cams, things like that. Sometimes activists can also force leaders to talk about policies that maybe they weren't considering. All right, so there are some rules about what lobbyists are allowed to do and not allowed to do. They're not allowed to take lobbying efforts as a tax deduction, because lobbying is not an essential part of running a business. They can't try to deduct lobbyist salaries as a business deduction. They're also not allowed to pay for meals, trips, parties, or gifts for members of Congress. This gets tricky because it's a pretty fine line between a legitimate business dinner and bribing a member of Congress with a $200 steak dinner, right? And it can be hard to tell the difference sometimes. Of course, they're not allowed to pay for a fact-finding mission to Hawaii, because obviously that's not legitimate. But they do sometimes take them out to dinner, or get them tickets to see Hamilton, or give them a signed jersey for kids. I mean, it's a very fine line to do. Although sometimes they can be very stupid. In Illinois, there are a couple of lobbyists who got in trouble for taking members of the state legislature out to a strip club and trying to pass it off as a legitimate proceeding. Obviously, that's not going to go over very well. It's usually a little bit more subtle than that. They're also required to disclose the amount and donor of small contributions in what's called bundling. So what they'll do is they'll take the small contributions that we give. Let's say I give a company $50 and Adrian gives them $75 and someone else gives them $20. What they'll do is they'll take all of those small donations, put them together and then give it off as a large contribution of, let's say, $5,000. They have to disclose who's giving the money and how much when they're bundling this money together. Even though there are policies, that doesn't necessarily mean lobbyists follow the law at all times. We've had lobbyists who go to jail for bribery, corruption, etc. There's a famous example during the George W. Bush administration of a man named Jack Abramoff. Basically, he was a lobbyist for Native American groups trying to get casinos on their land. So what he would do is take bribes from these various tribes, give them access to members of Congress in charge of regulating casinos, and allow them to persuade them not to let a rival tribe set up a casino. Basically, he was taking bribes to shut down the competition. And so he went to jail for that, right? Because you can't do that. You can't take bribes in exchange for access to members of Congress. But again, it is a very fine line between a legitimate business owner and a private. And more often than not, that line gets crossed, and we don't necessarily know about it. Okay. Interest groups can use the courts. This applies both to business interest groups and citizen interests. Interest groups can file a lawsuit, fund it, or file a companion brief for an existing case. So in the case of corporate interest groups using courts, the groups that represent the tobacco companies have kept the Justice Department tied up in court for decades over the issue of, did tobacco companies lie to consumers and hide how dangerous the product was? There has been some money paid out, but it's still an ongoing lawsuit. It's still working its way through the courts because the tobacco companies have billions of dollars that they can spend tying up the federal government in court indefinitely. For citizen groups, one of the best examples is the role of the NAACP in Brown versus the Board of Education. The NAACP had heard about the complaints from 4 separate families. And so rather than take them on one by one, combine them into one case, funded the costs of the lawsuit, and represented the families for free all the way up to the Supreme Court. So it was because of the NAACP that school segregation became illegal in 1954. If each family had been left to fight for it on their own, they probably wouldn't have had desegregation until the 1990s. It's because of the NAACP that school segregation was made illegal. It's also helped in the case of same-sex marriage. Obergefell was 3 different cases combined into one, challenging state laws that didn't allow for same-sex marriage. The citizen interest groups can use the courts to advocate for civil rights and civil liberties for a broad segment of society. We've seen conservative and religious interest groups trying to restrict Roe v. Wade. And they have been somewhat successful. No federal funding can go to pay for abortion. There are restrictions on how late into the pregnancy you can get an abortion. And in some cases, in some states, they've shut down a lot of the clinics. Here in Texas, for example, there is one clinic in the Rio Grande Valley that is licensed to perform abortions. Other than that, you have to go to San Antonio. So that's because of conservative groups chipping away at Roe. Now, they've tried to challenge surgical abortions because of COVID-19, been somewhat successful in that they were also trying to limit medical abortions where a woman takes two separate pills that essentially causes a miscarriage. And the Supreme Court recently said you can't do that because you don't need a doctor to administer the pills, and you don't need to see a doctor in person to do this type of abortion, so they struck down those restrictions. Also, states that have tried to pass restrictions on abortion as early as 6 weeks. Most women don't know they're pregnant until about 6 weeks. So it was seen as trying to circumvent Roe when the courts have struck that down repeatedly. But that's still an ongoing issue. We've also seen the ACLU using the courts to challenge state and federal laws. They went after a school in Mississippi that wouldn't allow a lesbian to bring her girlfriend to prom. They've gone after school districts for suspending students who won't stand for the Pledge of Allegiance. That's illegal. You cannot force a student to recite the Pledge of Allegiance. So they will go after local, state, and federal governments for restricting people's civil liberties. So for citizen interest groups, the courts can be a very effective mechanism for fighting against illegal restrictions on civil liberties and civil rights. We also see groups trying to use public opinion to help their cause. Major companies will use advertising to try and create this positive image, especially in the aftermath of a scandal. Oil and gas companies don't necessarily have the best reputation, so they'll talk about how they're investing in clean gasoline or what they do for their communities. After that oil rig explosion on the Gulf of Mexico in 2010, people stopped buying gas at BP stations. They were boycotting them. So to try and get the public back on their side, they started releasing these ads about how they're paying for cleanup, community involvement, and so on. A really funny example of this is some of those anti-smoking ads you see. If you look at them very closely, at the very bottom they'll say, paid for by Philip Morris as part of a lawsuit settlement. So the tobacco companies, as part of a lawsuit settlement, actually have to run anti-smoking ads, which is kind of funny when you think about it. You'll see companies like Amazon trying to rehabilitate their image. You've all seen the ads probably recently talking about safety in their warehouses, right, and how clean it is. Part of that's because they're being criticized for lack of proper air conditioning, unsafe working conditions, and so on. But they don't want to have a negative image of the public. They don't want people boycotting their product. So they'll use interest groups to promote their image. Clean oil, clean energy, things like that. Interest groups can also get the public to support their cause. Black Lives Matter demonstrations, things like that. Also grassroots mobilization. The NRA has a little over 3.5 million members. If Congress starts talking about gun control, they can tell the people to write their member of Congress and they'll get a flood of emails. So sometimes you can use the public to push for a particular cause. And we've seen this happening with social media and the internet. You can share a petition, you can share a news story, you can push for policy not to be passed. An example of this is a couple of years ago, there was discussion about creating what was called metered interns. Usually, internet access and speed is supposed to be the same regardless of how much you're paying for internet. What they wanted to do a couple years ago was start making it so your internet would be slower if you didn't pay as much compared to someone else. And they got a lot of backlash from people going, that's not fair, the internet should be a public utility. So they had to abandon the plan. Because there are people saying, look, I can only afford to spend $30 on the internet. Why should it take me 15 minutes to get on Netflix and someone who can pay $100 a month for internet can get on there in a minute, right? It just doesn't seem fair. So there was a lot of pushback from the public, and they ended up having to abandon that plan to kind of change the efficiency of the internet based on how much you're paying for it. Interest groups do get involved in politics. There are interest groups who will support particular candidates. Sometimes interest groups do form a political action committee, do choose to raise money for a particular candidate or issue. The NRA is not going to back someone who favors gun control. Planned Parenthood isn't going to support a pro-life candidate. They're going to back the candidates they see as sympathetic to their cause and issue. This is where we see them using political action committee to push for their cause. The NRA ran a political ad in 2016 that showed a woman alone in her house, and someone's breaking into her house, and she goes to her closet to get her handgun and on, and the premise of the message was Hillary Clinton will take away your guns and leave you defenseless. Accurate? No. Effective? Yeah. And they'll do that. They'll try to argue that people who don't support basically no restrictions on guns want to take away all of your guns. For politicians, political action committees are helpful because, of course, they can do the fundraising for them. They can run the ads maybe they don't want to. If an ad is too negative or too controversial, and a candidate doesn't want to run it, then the political action committee can do it for them. If there's backlash, they can say, well, it's not my campaign's ad, I had nothing to do with this. They're willing to work with them because they get money, they get ads, they get support. And sometimes interest groups can be very effective at winning an election. In 1994, there was a conservative backlash to the Clinton administration. So the Christian Coalition ran conservative Christian candidates for office. More than 60% of their candidates actually won. This is an example of an interest group being able to support particular candidates and actually winning. And for citizen groups, they'll look at trying to circumvent the state legislature. For example, if you want to raise the minimum wage in a state, you know the state legislature will say that's going to hurt business. And in some states, what they'll do is they'll get the issue on a state ballot and force the state legislature to comply with it if that ballot measure passes. If they know the state legislature is not going to take action, they'll go around them by using an election and then getting what they want. So an example of this is marijuana laws in Florida. The state legislature essentially said, we're not going to legalize medical marijuana. In 2014, voters got it on the ballot. And it got something like 52% of the vote. And then the state said, well, it had to get a supermajority of 60%, so it's not the law. So they got it back on the ballot in 2016. It got 62% of the vote, and the state was forced to set up medical marijuana. So if a union or citizens group knows they aren't going to get what they want from the state legislature, and they can get something on the ballot themselves, they'll just go around them. They'll just circumvent them and use people to get what they want, and then force the state legislature to do what they want it to do. It's a way of circumventing a legislature that says this will happen over our dead bodies. Okay, we'll make you. So interest groups today are very partisan. You don't see as much cooperation, as much willingness to compromise. On the issue of abortion, it's like people, in terms of interest groups, have become divided into two camps, pro-choice or pro-life. They don't seem to recognize that there is a little bit of a middle ground on the issue. They're so entrenched into this idea that it's all or nothing, that my side has to win and their side has to lose, and there's no middle ground. And it's unfortunate, but it's also a reflection of the way our politics is now, right? Congress isn't willing to compromise, so why would interest groups be willing? They also tend to focus on the needs of a narrow or small part of society. Now, part of that is because it's easier to advocate for 3 million people versus 30 million. It's easier to organize support around a small cause, a small area. It's easier to organize support for lower prescription costs for senior citizens than it is to organize for universal health care. Interest groups tend to focus on a very small, specific problem that can benefit a certain group of people. And the nature of the game, of course, is that there's always going to be winners and losers. But sometimes what this means is, if you give something to one group, you're taking it away from another group. So, AARP is very good at protecting Social Security and Medicare. What this means, though, is there's not enough discussion on the minimum wage, or the cost of college tuition, student loan debt. You don't hear the candidates talking too much this election about college tuition, right? You haven't heard a lot of talk about student loan debt, college tuition, and so on, and a lot more focus on senior citizens. So if we focus on the needs of senior citizens, we leave out young people from the discussion. If you focus on the needs of the wealthy, you leave out discussing the needs of the poor. So there's winners and there's losers, but sometimes the losers really get hurt in this fight. So the thing to take away from this is that interest groups are both beneficial and harmful to democracy. We need them because we can't advocate on our own. We can't get anywhere if it's only individuals pushing for change in society. So we need interest groups to help us. At the same time, because wealthier interest groups tend to win, it's not a level playing field. We don't have as much access to our politicians compared to people who are wealthy. You don't get enough discussion on raising the minimum wage, reducing car tuition, and so on. So we're being left out of this discussion in some ways. We can write a letter to our member of Congress and get something back like, yeah, thanks for writing to me. But if we were able to donate $10,000 to them, we'd get a much better response. It's not a level playing field. So we need interest groups, but we also need to find a way to fix the fact that it's clearly not a level playing field. That access is largely dependent on how much money and influence you have. The best example I can think of this is the minimum wage. What's the current minimum wage? $7.50 an hour, right? It hasn't gone up since 2009. We haven't raised the minimum wage in over a decade, despite the fact that the cost of living is constantly going up. A recent survey found that nowhere in the United States could a person rent a two-bedroom apartment on minimum wage. There's literally no state in the U.S. where that is possible. We are reaching the point where the minimum wage is no longer a living wage. You cannot work one minimum wage job and survive. The Congress isn't talking about that, right? We haven't seen any real discussion lately on raising the minimum wage. Even though the research has found that in major cities it should be $15 an hour, and everywhere else it needs to be a minimum of $10 an hour. We're not hearing that discussion. Right? We're not hearing Congress talking about this particular issue. So it's a problem, right? It's a problem that needs to be addressed sooner rather than later, because this is, I think, the longest we've gone in modern history without a even 50 cents an hour raise in the minimum wage. It's a problem, right? And it's obviously something that needs to be looked at. And yeah, there are arguments for and against it, but the fact that Congress hasn't increased the minimum wage in over, it's kind of problematic. Any thoughts, comments? Okay, so as a reminder, tonight is the last presidential debate. It's supposed to start at 8 p.m. our time. If you watch some or most of the debate, you can get extra credit if you write something up for it and email it to me. Hopefully it'll be a more civilized debate because they are going to mute the microphone for whoever is not supposed to be speaking. I'm not counting on it being that civil, but we can hope. Remember that your research paper is due November 10th. There is a sample paper online that you can look at to see how a student in a previous semester did. This was a student who did very well on the paper, so you can look at their paper and see what they did. If you want me to take a look at a rough draft of your paper, I will do that as well. Next week, we're going to tackle Congress and all of its story. So for next Tuesday, read the first half of chapter 12. If you have any questions between now and then, feel free to email me, call me, or stop by my office. And if you weren't here at the beginning for attendance, come see me for a minute. Otherwise, enjoy your week.